I'm Andy Murray, and as the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third in a series of joint seminars between the Infrastructure and Projects Authority and the Major Projects Association. For those unfamiliar with the association, we are a membership body with a purpose to improve the initiation and delivery of major projects through the interaction of our members in sharing experience, knowledge, research and ideas. As with our last joint event, our MC for today's topic of project pace is Gabriella Bossman. Gabriella has been a project delivery advisor in the Infrastructure and Projects Authority since May 2019, with focus areas including the EU transition portfolio of change programmes and border transformation. With experience in the public, private and third sectors internationally, Gabriella's programme and project management roles have taken her around the world and continue to drive her towards UK government and international development goals, placing people and authentic relationships at the centre. Gabriella, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you for your very kind introduction, Andy. And it's great to be with you all again for the third in the series of these MPA IPA events. As Andy mentioned, my name is Gabriella and I'm Project Delivery Advisor in the IPA. So the Infrastructure and Projects Authority reports to the Cabinet Office and Treasury and consists of project delivery experts from various fields who seek to advise and support the delivery of projects across the UK government. Much more to come on our organisation over the course of our event today, as our CEO will actually be joining us on the panel. So we have had over 1,200 people subscribe to this event today. So despite only seeing 6 of us on the screen, I think over the course of today, there are many others who will be joining you over the course of the event. So please do feel free to also engage with one another in the chat function that is available on this platform. So you're aware, we are also recording today's event for later sharing. So we will have a short presentation by Jessie Norman, followed by a Q&A with our panelists from the public and private sectors, respectively. I invite you all to use your phones and any other devices you have to log into Mentimeter, share and upvote any questions for the Q&A section of today's event. There will also be a poll to vote on, so please do keep engaged through the Mentimeter over the course of the event today. That is, I think, officially enough of my monologue. We would usually be expecting to have Jesse open with a keynote speech at the beginning, but he hasn't yet joined yet due to technical difficulties. So we're going to dive straight in to actually introducing our panel members for today. So first, we have Kerry Bangle from Nichols Group, currently supporting the Department for Transport, where her previous assignments included HS2 Senior Sponsor Area in the South, Crossrail Commercial Advisor and Communications for TfL's Delivery Capability Programme, to name just a few. She has over 20 years experience in Australia and in the UK in major transport infrastructure projects and has been leading DfT's response to the PM's Infrastructure Delivery Task Force Project Speed. We also have with us today Clare Mortimer of IBM Services, a UK AI cognitive and analytics leader. With nearly, again, 20 years of consulting experience, Clare has used her background in statistics and operational research to bring data into the strategic decision-making for clients across various industries. As an executive partner of the public sector, she works primarily with clients in law enforcement and healthcare to establish data analytics and AI capabilities that enable transformation of their operations. Our very own Nick Smallwood will also be joining us today, Chief Executive in the IPA and Head of Government's Projects Delivery Function. He is the former Vice President for Projects Engineering and Chief Project Engineer at Shell previously. He joins the IPA with 37 years experience of managing complex project portfolios and having developed Shell's Global Project Academy. At Shell, Nick was accountable for managing how projects were delivered and a variety of significant improvement programs. Nick was also a trustee of the board of the APM, where he contributed to the overall development of the UK's project management by profession. And lastly, but definitely not least, we have Andy Murray, who you saw earlier today, who is MPA Executive Director. Andy joined the Major Projects Association after a 30-year career as a practitioner and management consultant, helping organisations deliver strategic change through project and programme management. He draws on varied experience of working across multiple sectors, working with widely differing organisations, and has lived and worked overseas. So panelists, whilst we give our audience the opportunity to get their questions up on Mentimeter, I have a starter for 10. After decades of commissions and reports on major projects, productivity and pace remain arguably stubbornly hard to shift. What have we been doing all this time, and what can we do to speed up projects? I will start first of all with Kerry, because she seems quite keen to answer that first question potentially, unless I completely misread the verbal cues there. Thank you.
The body language. Thank you. No, I mean, it's an excellent challenge, isn't it? And I think because with something this thorny, there isn't a simple, straight answer. But I think there are several facets, and actually, I don't think all of them are that palatable, I'm afraid. So I think, firstly, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're not seeing a shift in pace or productivity, because neither are we seeing any real change in the fundamental makeup of the leadership of our projects. It remains stubbornly white and male, and I think we need greater variety and diversity of thought and the approach, to bring in new perspectives. And this may be why we make the same mistakes over and again. Making mistakes is how we learn. And so we shouldn't shy away from them or indeed lambast those who make mistakes. But, and this came up as a theme on my roundtable on productivity, we aren't making unique mistakes. We're making the same ones. And frankly, that's unforgivable. Secondly, and sort of allied to that, I don't think we're putting people sufficiently at the heart of what we're doing. I've been lucky enough, as we said, to have been involved with the Project Speed initiative from its embryonic stages. And the one thing that has been a consistent thread throughout all the work streams is the importance of people. We can write processes and produce metrics and databases and reports and whizzy technology, legislation, but ultimately it's all reliant on the people who use it. The custom and practice builds up over time like layers of sediment, and it becomes part of the way that we do things. And, the thought of stirring all of that up is daunting. And it's sort of extending the metaphor, I suppose. Those waters become murky and harder to navigate until they settle again, and we can end up with greater uncertainty. So I think, putting people at the heart of things is definitely needed. And the final one for me is I think, a decision-making paralysis. So in the world of projects, we seem to always be waiting for something else, another piece of information, sign off from someone far more important, an overarching strategy to be in place, which means we end up putting off making decisions until some kind of wished for nirvana moment, which of course never arrives. And we take comfort in having more data, but I think this may only get worse as the systems get increasingly digitized and producing ever more data. So I think the key is working out what is important and turning that data into true insight and wisdom to inform the decisions and make quicker decisions. So we'll never have 2020 vision for our project decisions. So, let's work out upfront what was important, stick to it at all stages of the life cycle and live by that. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons, as we're reflecting, is why the Ventilator Challenge programme was a success, was because it had that universally agreed vision, a simple, compelling purpose that was, impossible to argue with. And I think it made the decision making that much more straightforward. The knack, of course, is to take the lessons learned on that and see how we can apply them in different contexts. So I think that would be my slightly long answer to that you pose.
No, that's brilliant. It's giving us a lot of meat to sort of pull off of for the rest of the questions to follow. And I actually quite like to pull on one of the elements that you spoke around about people. And I know that within the IPA, there's been a lot of discussion. And as Nick has joined us, there has been quite a bit of a view on what people, the importance of people to the successful delivery of projects and programs. So I'd like to hand over to Nick to speak to that and pull out that point specifically.
Thanks, Gabriella. Absolutely right. I have a very clear statement that says people deliver projects. And so whilst you do need process, you need good people and you need competent people with the right skills. And in the ever-changing world we have with all the cross-cutting initiatives, net zero and the digital agenda, it becomes even more important now than ever that we train and educate the full cadre of our project community, from fast streamers coming into government right up to the major leadership project academy and having mastery skills. But to answer the question that was posed, I think it's worth highlighting we do have pockets of best practice where we can deliver on time and budget. A good example is the 1.5 billion A14 improvement scheme delivered on budget and 6 months early. And they focused on getting the basics right, getting the fundamental elements right, and working collaboratively across the supply chain to deliver excellence. And I think we need to recognise that we need to get those basics right on every project. No amount of good engineering, hard work, good construction effort will do very much to deliver a badly developed project or a badly selected project. So it's about really knowing what we want to achieve as an outcome and having the right team in place to deliver on that outcome. And I make the observation that we're not very good at cost estimating and going along with that, determining what the right schedule should be. Inaccurate estimation of costs at the front end, you might even choose the wrong project to begin with in terms of what benefits you expect to get. So that's why, alongside the publication of the National Infrastructure Strategy, the IPA has launched two really important work streams from my perspective. Firstly, we're going to publish some guidance setting out cost estimating best practice across all government projects. The approach will look to consolidate best practices in cost estimating across all leading organisations and set out practical guidance for project teams to follow. And secondly, we've kicked off some work to develop and promote a centralised benchmarking platform that teams can refer to and look at, should cost modelling. And hopefully the benchmarking hub will give projects access to actual outturn cost and performance data that similar projects have had to develop their own cost estimates. But at the end of the day, indeed, it's our people that deliver, and the people have to have the right skills to recognise what part they play in sticking to those key principles of success. Back to you.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm actually quite keen to pull out a couple of the points that you raised there, which I think link quite nicely to Claire's area of expertise, which is around data. So pulling out from the point that Nick has made around people and their importance, how do we then look at some of the benchmarking points that he's made around cost estimation, etc., and data analytics, which is very much in your world, to improve, if not the pace, at least the efficiency and the effectiveness in which we deliver our projects?
Yeah, so, I've almost forgotten what the original question was, Gabriella. We've come so far and covered so much ground since we started. And some really interesting ground I'd like to say always find yourself back with data and analytics. And I think in some ways we've covered this, right? So in everything we do now, we are constantly generating data. And the key thing is to ensure that we're not just generating data, but actually we are considerate when we look at the data that is being produced within the project, that it's the data which will actually be built into the decision-making processes. And you have to have those two things kind of continuously tied together. We're seeing, certainly in the technology world, right across major projects now, learning lessons from the way that data is used in digital product development, where that listening, to Kerry's point on people, right? Listening to your consumer, listening to the people who are going to use and implement the decision, actually, and taking the data which reflects those things which matter to them and bringing that right into the decision. Because often programs can get divorced from the real consumers of the output. We get so embedded in the delivery of the program itself that the two get divorced. So actually, I could talk about how you give the nuts and bolts of how you use the data, but actually it's about getting the data which really measures the things which impact on the final outcome and being able to tie those two pieces together so that you're really generating data which is directly part of the decision-making process, but also about ensuring the people who are involved in that decision-making process are comfortable with the data that's being provided to them, because people, at the end of the day, however good the data and the machines are, right, we're all still humans, and so we all still make decisions on the basis of our own confidence that insight which is being given to us is something we really believe and trust. And so it's really important that those decision makers have confidence in the data and confidence to use that data and that insight to influence the decisions that they make without taking away from all of the expertise that goes with that in the minds of those people who are making decisions.
For that contribution. We've got quite a bit of activity on the Mentimeter at the moment, so I'm going to pivot to give the audience what they want. And one of the main questions we've got here that's been upvoted is, what are the lessons learned from previous projects which speed up the delivery, including quicker decision making? I'm actually going to come to you, Andy, on this, as actually the centre of expertise around major project delivery. In your view, how do we make sure that we're gathering those lessons, and what are those key lessons to ensure that we can infuse pace within project delivery?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the discussions we've just had, because it seems that our question of pace is inextricably linked to the question of performance in terms of how projects proceed. So, one of the challenges we've always had with learning lessons, particularly around major projects, is that the team that comes together, across multiple organisations, come on and move off the project at various stages in the project's life cycle. So often there isn't if you like, that single version of the truth of what really happened, all the way through the life cycle. So, what Claire was talking about, the amount of data that gets produced, where is it? It sort of sits in different silos. So there's an inherent challenge there around learning lessons, whether that's around pace or other factors. What's interesting in terms of, from my own experience, about 30 years or so now in the world of projects, some of those as practitioner, but also as an advisor and assurer. So I've actually seen many hundred, large and major projects. And one of the things that, the question of pace is, and which is why I sort of congratulate the IPA's work on the principles for success, is the lack of basics. And often we look for innovation and sophistication around project approaches and so on, when there is just a lack of the basics, getting the fundamentals right, would then undermine those other innovative or creative approaches. And so, if I narrow down to the specific sort of part of that question around decision making, so this for me is a question of around governance, so setting up the right governance structures and mechanisms, and culture and behaviour as a part of that governance, not just about the process, but getting that right really early. So it's really clear what decisions need to be made, when, and by whom, in order for the project to proceed. And if I just give you one example of an organisation I spent a few years working within to tackle, the very topic of pace of or speed of decision making, and we assessed. It was around, let's say it's about 80 or so projects, but a large number of quite significant projects. And we looked at the amount of time that the projects were putting into their schedule for the initial, let's call it full business case approval, it's the nearest equivalent. And on average, they had 3.5 months longer than what it was taking them. So they were planning to be slower than they could otherwise be if they just picked an average. And that's because of the consequences of not getting it right and then having to go back. So there's all sorts of behavioural reasons why they were doing that. And then one of the issues that we found there around decision making was that approvals were done on a serial basis, going up through every single layer to the highest one that was responsible for making the final decision. Whereas actually there are other mechanisms of perhaps doing some of those things in parallel and only going for approval once. So that's just sort of one example of sort of decision making. So it's really been about clear of who needs to say yes for what, when, and then optimizing those processes to get that clarity.
That's a really insightful. And I saw, if I'm reading again the non-verbal cues, if we saw Nick nodding in agreement with some of those comments there, and I have a feeling that something around front-end loading might come up in this conversation too. So I'm going to offer the floor to you, Nick, now to just cover that.
Yeah. So I'm absolutely with Andy in terms of decision roadmap. I mean, a good project should have that decision roadmap. They need to focus early on what is it we're trying to achieve. All too often projects set off and they rush to action, even into rushing to construction when you haven't completed the detailed design, and you always take longer. You take longer if you haven't aligned your stakeholders. You take longer if you're not clear on what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. And to be quicker in projects, you need to actually spend that time in the front end to align the stakeholders and really understand what it is you're doing. You then need to do the right level of technical work to support the accuracy of the estimate. And only then can you understand what it is you're doing, how much it's going to cost. And you need to factor in a robust methodology to then deliver. And quite often, every element is rushed. And then we actually take far longer to actually realize the end result at the end. So for me, it's doing the basics right, doing them right in the right sequence, and ending up having a project that will deliver much quicker than rushing with an army of people in the construction phase, hoping that you can actually deliver something quicker. And I just have the personal experience of a project that was done really, really, really well and took a long time. And we were held back from going to the supply chain until we'd done our homework. We built a petrochemical plant in 18 months. I saw the very similar plant take 3 years because people said, no, don't need to do all that, we'll rush. So double the time. So project speed is about challenging us to get back into doing the basics right, to deliver projects much quicker than we see in the marketplace today.
I don't know if I can go to Kerry now on how do you actually find this balance between ensuring that there is pace in the delivery, but to Nick's point and Andy's point indeed around setting something up for success, how do we make sure that we've got pace, but that we are taking the time that we need at the beginning from your own experiences?
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think pace shouldn't be something that we do at the expense of anything else, and I think this is the, it shouldn't get any cost. So it has to be for a purpose and a value. And I think exactly as Nick says, what is the outcome that we're stretching for here? Simply shouting at people to do things quicker just doesn't work. There's anyone who's asked to put a child to put on their school shoes, knows we can't just shout at people and expect things to, miraculously happen quicker. So I think we have to be clear about why we want things to go faster. And I also think I've lost the screen. No, I also think that one of the things that resonated for me there, if I may, was around the choosing the right project. I think quite often we end up with, dare I say it, pet projects or projects that just refuse to die. And I think getting some courage about killing projects and cancelling projects is a really hard thing to do because of the invested time, the emotional investment, as you say, the stakeholders that you've worked with up front. So when I worked for Heathrow, a project called AirTrack, it was an £800 million rail infrastructure project that linked Terminal 5 to Staines and then into Waterloo. And there was an AirTrack forum. There were loads and loads of stakeholders that had massive vested interest in it. But ultimately, the scheme had a very, very weak business case for the airport, and the public purse who were funding it. There was a very poor business case for it. So it took quite a lot of courage and probably a good nearly year's worth of work to actually get to the point where we could say we're going to have to cancel the project. So it does happen, but we probably need to get better at killing projects as a profession as well as accelerating.
Thank you, Kerry. I'm going to come to Claire now on what is the top question on Mentimeter, and potentially as someone who's from the private sector looking in as to why we're getting things so wrong. So we have a question here: why do government projects take longer and cost more when compared to the private sector? So it's no small question, but maybe as someone who sits on the outside, that you can give us a bit of a telling off as to what we're doing so wrong.
Well, I'm not going to give you a telling off. I'm going to make some observations, I think. So firstly, I would say I'm not sure that is absolutely always true. Right? There are some things that the government do at least as well, if not better, than private sector. And I think one of the things with government programmes is they are much more visible than kind of commercial sector programs. So there are all sorts of programs that happen in the private sector which can be sort of hidden away because they didn't quite go how people would like them to. So there are absolutely, large scale project failures in the private sector, as well as there are in government. My observation, having spent quite a long time working with government programs, is it is back to the comments that were just made around that kind of complexity of the stakeholder environment. Very often public programs have such complex stakeholders and everybody is very conscious of those stakeholders. In a private sector world, there are often just as many stakeholders, but it's much easier for me to put up some walls around the project and say, actually, the opinions which matter are these, and the opinions which I'm going to listen to but later are those. And I think the public sector are probably less good at separating out the really key opinions to get the programme delivered right from those opinions which are absolutely important, but maybe could be put to one side whilst we get on and deliver something. So I think that would probably be my number one piece is, in any programme, there are so many opinions and so many people with their requirements and a desire to deliver on such a broad piece. So that would be my main one. The second observation I would make is the very structured kind of business case approach that you get within public sector programs sometimes does drive you down a path of almost defining things to a level of detail before you're ready. And sometimes people can spend an enormous amount of time creating that plan and business case, and not wanting really to disagree with Nick's point about doing your homework, but doing enough of the right homework sometimes is actually insufficient to get you through that business case process. And so people do a whole load more work. And it's not uncommon for us to get involved in programs as a supplier to support delivery. You know, when people have spent years doing work without actually engaging a supplier community to say, does this feel right? And then a lot of things get rethought, and therefore you extend the timeline. So I think really being focused on what is the set of things that you need to do to ensure that you're going to deliver value, and ensure that you're going to set off on a defined track, but without doing so much work that actually, there's almost a spurious level of accuracy in the work that's being generated. They would be my two main observations, Gabriella.
And I think maybe Nick was attempting to come in there. Please do feel free to follow up from.
Yeah, I was going to just share an observation that if you look at the data from various reviews that have been done in the private sector, something like 75% of mega capital projects, that is projects over £2 billion, are failures in terms of cost and schedule delivery. So you're dealing with a very small percentage which are successful. If you then come into the private sector, into the public sector, what I've observed in my time in government is we're delivering some of the largest, most complex, and in many cases, novel projects on the planet. And certainly some of the transformation projects that take place in government are truly challenging to deliver, with many millions of customers, often the citizens of the UK, sometimes more than one IT system, and sometimes without clarity of architecture of what changes you have to go through in terms of the technical work, as well as the soft side skills change that comes with them. So our starting point is a really complex space, which then drives you to all the comments I made about that front end loading. You have to really have the discipline, because there's no room for mistakes in a complex world, and it is challenging for sure.
If I can just stay with you on that point around the work that's being facilitated and the analysis that's sort of coming to the fore in the work that the IPA are doing around examples of what can be done to actually accelerate projects. So we've spoken about the important steps in advance of the real program delivery that need in terms of front-end loading and setting up. What other steps are being taken to ensure, or what other tools are available to support programs and striking that balance between front-end loading and supporting at the beginning, but then supporting pace throughout the delivery of the program?
So shall I come in on that?
Yes, please.
So, Project Speed has been focusing to help us in exactly that space. So looking at all the elements of inefficiency and bureaucracy that slow projects down, starting with the planning and the environmental regulations, moving into the time we take to develop, looking at whether we have the competency and capacity and capability across our senior project professionals, and then what can we do in the supply chain in terms of being in a strong place with the infrastructure in the construction world, as well as actually taking reform seriously in the procurement space as we transition out of the European Union. So there's a whole raft of initiatives in that space, Gabriella, that will drive us forward and free up time and space to do the basics right. But then I think we also need to reflect on the type of infrastructure we're building and look at introducing modern methods. So the digital world is upon us and we need to embrace it. And for much of the built environment, we need to move to modern methods of construction, design one, build many, off-site fabrication and on-site assembly, which takes huge swathes of hours out of a construction site, makes it safer, lowers the cost and reduces the schedule. So I think there's lots that we can do that actually help us to meet the government's ambition to build back better, greener and stronger.
Thank you, Nick. I wonder if I can invite Kerry to speak to that as we touch on Project Speed there.
Yeah, thanks. So the bit of project, there are two themes within Project Speed that struck me as quite powerful. One was the planning and consents area, and deregulation and speeding up how we consent our infrastructure. I come from a DFT perspective, so it's very much around the transport consenting regime, which is largely the nationally significant infrastructure projects under the Development Consent Order process, and the Highways Act and the Transport and Works Act orders. So there's been quite a lot of work gone into this area, some painful workshops where we've stepped through each step of the way with Highways England colleagues and Network Rail colleagues on how we, take a scheme through the consenting process and what we can do to speed that up. And so there's a lot of work that we can do in that area, I think, to take some of the time out of the process. And I think one of the comments in the chat box there from Simon Addiman was around things like timing. It's not just taking time out; it's also about certainty. And I think that's one of the things where we can really help is give greater certainty in that sort of quite murky space of planning and consents, and do more to make sure that we're more got more certainty about how we're scheduling some of that stuff. The other piece of work that's come out of Project Speed is on the governance and accountability, the sort of the decision making space and how we approve projects, which is deeply complex, and this is sort of ripe for, I won't say reform, but there's certainly ripe for a greater look. And I think that is certainly a Project Speed theme for the new year, is to get more into how we streamline that governance and approval and make sure that, as Claire eloquently put it, that we're doing enough of the right homework, which I really like as a concept, because I don't think we are. I think we are, business case writing is a giant cottage industry, and what project delivery people are not doing well enough is understanding what are the issues that the funders and the clients and the sponsors really want from this project. What is it that would assuage their fears? What is it that is likely to cause them to say no to a project, and really getting under the skin of that. And I think we as a profession need to do a lot better on that. So that's where I'd leave my two penny.
Very much, Kerry. And on that point, I would just like to send apologies from Jessie Norman, who unfortunately hasn't been able to join us today because of some technical challenges and difficulties. However, we still have a lot of questions from the audience coming through on Mentimeter, so I don't think we'll have any issue around content to cover off today. So I will be reverting back to the Mentimeter questions for the rest of today's session. Just a reminder to everyone that we also have a poll available on Mentimeter, information soon to come up on the screen, where you can upvote one of the key questions around pace that we've been covering off over the course of today's event already. But I will revert back to the panelists now on some of the questions that are already on Mentimeter. And one of the key ones I'm reading here is this more about failing fast as opposed to necessarily delivering fast? We can deliver more quickly, but if we deliver the wrong thing in the longer term, it will take us longer. Now, this touches on some of the points that we've already made about killing things off, etc. But be keen to hear your voice and your views, Andy, on this particular question around failing fast as opposed to pace in delivery.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think touching on one of Claire's observations earlier, I think that the private sector is often better at failing fast because the projects are less in the public domain, so there's less lobbying, if you like, that's going on in terms of their continuation or amendment or change of direction, and also I think there's a difference there in terms of specialism, if you like, in terms of the private sector organisations are very specialist generally in their area of expertise, whereas there's a much greater breadth of purpose in these major projects that we've been talking about earlier. So I do agree in terms of failing fast, but that's not necessarily linked to project failure, which it's not as binary as that. It's not a case of project succeeds and then project fails, but it might be elements of what's being done that's not quite working, or it's not supporting the project, and those things need to be acted upon quickly, improved, and move on. So I don't like the concept of a project failure as such, but more sort of techniques or approaches or methods failure, or the setup that's failing. Learn from it quickly, amend, improve what's remaining to go on the project is the right approach.
So I saw a lot of non-verbal cues from both Claire and Nick there. I'm going to say ladies first, Claire, and then immediately following Nick. Please do feel free to chime in on that.
Thanks. Well, so the concept of failing fast is very much one in the kind of agile delivery methods, and in the technology program space, we've been on, I think, a real journey with agile. We were all very evangelically agile about 10 years ago, and everything was about failing fast, almost to the point where we were failing for the sake of making sure we'd failed, so that we could say we'd failed fast enough. And I think, and that agile concept grew out of really quite small, isolated, simple kind of delivery within a technology software development space where failing actually has relatively low cost. And when you try and do that, even within the technology space, in a complex integration program, actually, there's a point at which you need to manage the number of kind of channels that you kick off and how far you go, so that you don't, you have to look at that cost of failure and get the balance right. So you're failing at the right point. Again, it's not about, there's no right and wrong about, you should or shouldn't, but doing things at the right point where you're really looking at what's the cost of this failing now, and therefore, do we have the confidence that this is the right point to go forwards? And I think we've learned a lot of lessons on balancing that in the technology space. And I think historically, the technology space has learned a lot from the infrastructure kind of world in terms of that project rigor. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to start to share back the other way some of the lessons that we've learned around how you define a minimum viable product and then delivering incremental value in complex programs in technology, and how we can kind of share some of that learning back into the infrastructure program space, because it's not as simple as it kind of sounds when we talk about agile and failing fast, because it gets to be very, very costly. And so I think we have to kind of just think that through. But there's definitely lessons been learned in the last decade in complex integration programs that I think we could share better into the infrastructure space.
Nick, over to you to continue on that point. Thank you.
Yeah, well said, Claire. I couldn't agree more with every single word you said. So it's good and pleasing to hear. And you actually addressed one of the comments I was going to make around agile and failing fast. But I think let's be pragmatic here. If you were building a large infrastructure investment, why would you want it to fail? Why would you want to do a design and get it wrong and go back and recycle? That for me is bonkers. You would never wish to do that. So I do think there's an opportunity to use a lot of the agile philosophy in waterfall projects. You can have a sprint to get to a desired solution for a subcomponent of a big project and use that thinking and methodology. But I don't subscribe to the failing fast and out of control. I think that's just mismanagement and bad management, and often used as an excuse. So I don't need to repeat what Claire said. She very eloquently summed it up.
Message received loud and clear from all of the panelists. Jonathan, if I can just get you to put up the slide on the Mentimeter poll, just to encourage some of our audience to engage there again. So for those who haven't yet voted, it's not too late. But as we see here, the question that we have posed to you all is, do faster projects necessarily mean better projects? And we actually have a low number of people saying yes, with a middle number saying no, and then majority saying it depends, which very much ties in with some of the discussions that we've already been having. I don't know if, Kerry, you wanted to come in on that point, because we had a few discussions before the panel today on your views on pace.
Yeah, well, I mean, it looks like we're all a bunch of fence sitters, doesn't it, by saying it depends? But of course, that is always, there's always a but, isn't there, in all of this sort of stuff? It's never that straightforward. But I think it is. I think I do agree with this. It does depend, because you can't chase, acceleration at any cost. And I think, we've sort of mentioned this already. It's a bit like, I guess, you like wanting to have your cake, eat it, and not put on weight, isn't it? Really. Right. So, I think pace has got to be, and as we said, the project speed sort of banner has been better, greener, and there's sort of faster. So it's and then we've got this new sort of dimension of leveling up as well. So there's all these different things to balance, as well as just pure speed. So is it possible to have the cake, eat it, and not put on weight? Well, I think it probably is, if we judiciously pick the right projects, which is sort of a theme that we've just been debating. So, for example, at DFT, we're planning some legislative improvements, which around the traffic regulation order space and the street right space, which, amongst other things, will actually make it cheaper, simpler, and quicker for local authorities to make changes to streets, including installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So I think that's something that is an example of a project that is going to be faster, but it will also combine all the other elements that we're trying to go for. So I remain hopeful.
Brilliant. Nick, over to you. I saw you nodding as well at some of the points that Kerry was making.
Yeah, I just thought I'd share some observations from my time delivering portfolios of projects where we used to do a lot of benchmarking in the private sector. And I think there's a body of data that will show you that the lowest cost projects for a given commodity are typically faster than industry average. And actually, if you think about it, that makes sense, doesn't it? That if you had a project to deliver a particular scope and you hung around for 3 months too long, you've got to pay for the establishment for those 3 months. Equally, if you go the other side and you try and go even quicker, you end up building as you're still designing, and then you make mistakes and have to recycle, and eventually your costs blow out and your schedule never gets achieved anyway. So it's all about finding that optimum pace to deliver at pace the right solution. And I think often we lose track and we talk about speed and time rather than thinking about the optimum solution. And I never forget, you know, the old wise construction supervisor when I was on my first project as a construction manager. And I said, when should we actually mobilize to the field? And he said, not yet. I said, well, we're 70% complete on design. He said, not yet. And it got to 75%. And, you know, the guys were chomping at the bit to go to the field. And he said, not yet, not yet. I said, well, how much longer? He said, wait another month. Why? He said, because they'll be raging to get going. And actually what he showed me is if you've got all the design deliverables ready to go to the field, you start with higher productivity and you can sustain it. If you start a project and you're constantly looking for work and finding access because you haven't got the design deliverables or you're not clear on the scope, people just, they want to be busy. They don't want to hang around. We haven't got a lazy construction community. We've got people who want to do a good job. So you have to provide them with the materials and the access and clarity of what you want in which order. And if you're not ready, going to the field and having shovels in the ground, you'll be busy doing unnecessary work and inappropriate work and not following the critical path. So it's a bit too, it depends. But my view is you can have your cake and you can eat it. It's just a case of don't eat too much cake because you'll get fat and be overspent.
Be overspent. That's a good way to end that point. I do want to pivot ever so slightly to some of the questions that are being posed here around the wider operating environment that we are delivering programs and projects in now. So the government has thrown down the gauntlet to build back faster, but also to build back greener, build back better, and to level up the country. In the midst of a pandemic, can we really have all of these things together? And which of these aspirations is more realistic given the capability, funding, and political and public support? I don't know who to begin with. It's a tough question to answer, but I see a big smile from both Andy and Claire. So I'll start with Andy and then go over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriella. I think we've had part of an answer to this already. Which is around taking that portfolio view and perhaps linking it to a recent National Audit Office report on the progress towards 2050 net zero. And the conclusion they made was it's the coordination and the joining up of the initiatives that will enable them all to move forward at a greater pace. So I think there's a lot of we've been talking about, projects aren't in isolation, they are in that wider environment. So that portfolio is really important. I think we can have all three, or was it four there? But it is about understanding the trade-offs and the payoffs. And whenever you're sort of faced with dilemmas like this, where you want to have your cake and eat it. Applying the sort of the game theory analysis, I think, really helps. And so with that, it's about what is it that we're trying to speed up is a really critical question in the context of those other parameters. Is it that we want to deliver those other things at speed in order to get earlier economic activity that can then generate receipts that can be recycled, generate subsequent further greater activity, or to pay off the debt. But what is the purpose before we can then start to think about the tactics and the strategies to do it? So all of them are possible, but what is the purpose of speed against those objectives is what I would say. So, just by way of sort of an analogy, if you were to give a site to a developer, they don't set out to build what they want to develop on that site as quickly as they can. Their master plan is typically done in phases, and it's such so that they will optimize the yield, the returns against that site by getting anchor tenants in early that will then be used to pay for future phases or to attract future tenants and clients because they've got a significant brand going into their development really early. That's not the same schedule as building it as quick as they can. It's about their purpose of getting that return for the least investment. So purpose, I think, is important against those other objectives.
Thank you, Andy, and over to you, Claire, to continue on that.
Yeah, and I think it's so absolutely, Andy, agree. Having clarity about kind of where you're measuring on each of those dimensions is really important. I was going to pick up on actually, you almost need to understand the whole life cost against each of those dimensions. Certainly on the green agenda, with building back now, there's a great opportunity to really fuse the technology that we have available to us in infrastructure projects so that you can drive both efficiency and a greener outcome, through those developments. But, and having that real-time understanding of both what's happening in construction and once those projects are up and running and the buildings themselves, that infrastructure is in place so that you can maximize continuously optimizing that for the green agenda. If you look at that whole life view, I think there's a tremendous opportunity, but it does depend on, as Andy says, the purpose, but also when you're measuring against each of those dimensions.
Thank you both for that. I'm going to go back to the Mentimeter questions here. We've got one specifically for Kerry, and it is here. Would Kerry be kind enough to expand more on what they need to do to put people at the heart of what we're doing? What do we need to do differently if we are to pivot back to that conversation that we had around people, which is one of the first points that you made about people being integral to effective project and program management and delivery?
Thank you. I'm on mute. Yeah, I do think that we focus too heavily on processes, and we try to processes have a place, but they aren't the be all and the end all, and people will work their way around things. Custom and practice builds up, so we need to be cognizant of the value that people bring. So in the panel session that I ran on productivity, we had an interesting discussion around productivity and understanding that some people within networks are more productive than others. So identifying who those individuals are, through network health checks and some of them sort of the social analytics technology that we have, not in a sort of scary Big Brother kind of way, but understanding who the key people in networks are and focusing on what individuals bring to the party, rather than just sort of a kind of holistic view of, well, tick, we've done collaboration, we've brought a consultant in to do that. So suddenly productivity is going to go up. It's kind of finding out what makes people tick more and doing more around how networks work, particularly in major projects where it's not always obvious how things even get done and who does them, which isn't a particularly brilliant answer, I realise, to the question, but no, throw it back to the person who asked it.
No, that's helpful. It's on Mentimeter, so unfortunately we can't see who's it's come through from, but we had a few people agree as an important point to raise. And I wonder if we stay on the subject of people. We've spoken about people in terms of stakeholder engagement, but there's also a lot to do about training and people that are in programs being equipped to do the things that they need to do. And I know there's a lot of work that the IPA is doing through the MPLA, etc., to build up that expertise within programs. So I'll pass on to Nick to speak to.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriella. For me, it's about having competent and capable people. And going on a course doesn't make you either competent or capable. It's one measure of how much you were given in the way of knowledge, and you either choose to take it in or not. So I think we have a role in government to actually do a much better job of skilling our community of project professionals right from when they join government as fast streamers through to graduating as mastery and delivering our most complex programs as senior responsible officers. So we're going to be implementing what we call the Government Projects Academy in the new year. We're going to look at having some very clear measures of competency, assessment and accreditation, so that people actually have to have the demonstrable skills at various levels. We've got a really fantastic diverse community actually in the project profession, but not at the senior levels, not at the senior grades. We've only got about 20% females delivering on our major projects and programs. So I really agree with Kerry, we need to be more diverse, not only in gender, but in terms of background as well, because the diverse community will see what you don't see and bring innovative solutions and better solutions. So we're going to be tackling it from indeed that gender lens, that diversity lens, and then the skills and competency lens. And we're taking the opportunity to refresh our major flagship programs like the Project Leadership Program, and next year the major Project Leadership Program that currently gets delivered jointly with Oxford Business School. So I'm quite excited that the focus on people and really having people come to the table to demonstrate their skills and then recognizing them for having those skills is a huge opportunity. And then we can start to close the gap on some of the language used in government projects where you clearly understand people maybe don't know what they mean when they talk about their cost estimate being P70. And that's got nothing to do with the level of accuracy of a cost estimate. So it's a bee in my bonnet about cost estimating, but we really do need to skill up our resource because people are key. Kerry's absolutely right. You know, a process is a guideline, but really competent people, they know what needs to be done. They intuitively know, and the guide is there for if they've forgotten, but they will actually get the right piece of work done. And I think that's hugely powerful.
Thank you, Nick. I know that the MPA also holds an important role in these people discussions. So I'll pass over to Andy to comment on some of the discussions we're having there too.
Yeah, it's thanks, Gabriella. So we found that there's plenty of the technical development that's around, but what our members continually tell us is it's the behavioural aspects that is really a struggle, and often that's because of the development pathways that people work through before they end up being a major project leader and having a big influence over the performance of a project. And it's different, and it's complex to leading business as usual or operational or functional teams, and typically you're the only one sat at the pinnacle of a major project. So alongside the technical aspects, and we talked earlier on about things like governance frameworks, and we talked about agile versus we didn't use the term waterfall, but traditional approaches elsewhere. That's okay, but actually it's about the behaviours that drive good performance in projects. And come back to really the earlier point I made around where we can speed up projects outside of the structural elements, and it is focusing on those waste elements first, and that often comes through lack of clarity, lack of understanding, and a lack of cohesion of the senior leaders involved in projects. So they've definitely got to expose themselves and look at the broader aspects of skill sets required for undertaking that role.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to pivot slightly as I want to finish off as many of the Mentimeter questions, as I've seen there's quite a bit of exciting conversation that's happening in the chat on Pine and the Pine platform itself as well. But I'm going to come to you, Claire, just following on the point on governance and one of the questions that's here on Mentimeter. And it says, decision-making complex governance structures can have a major impact on delivery speed. What are the panel's views on moving towards a minimal viable governance model for major projects? It's not an easy one, but I'll start off with Claire and then move on to.
Well, so actually, I think the key to successful decision making is having that real clarity on who are the people who really are empowered to make those decisions, and in a sense, having that clarity so that it is almost minimum viable governance, right? Who are the people who absolutely you can't progress unless they've given the nod, and having almost sounds very boring and structured, but almost having a RACI within your decision-making process and your governance forums, actually which are the governance groups which really hold a decision, and which are the ones that absolutely need to be informed, but they need to understand that that's their job, is simply to be informed. And actually, I think one of the ways that we get into confusion when we're delivering programs is actually building in almost too much complexity in the governance. I have also fallen over the opposite, particularly where programs have grown rapidly or set themselves up very quickly, where you don't have the structured governance, and then you end up in that space where, you know, you're almost having to rework because the right people haven't been consulted and the right sign-offs haven't been given, and there are maybe, you know, strategic elements that you're not aware of, and so I think there is definitely value in exploring the concept of minimum viable governance, but being really clear on what is sufficient, making sure it genuinely is sufficient. The other lesson around that we could take from what we do when we're defining a minimum viable product is the focus in that is always on the value. So what is the value that you're adding? And actually, you know, it's an interesting conversation in a governance context. What's the value of this piece of governance? And I think actually bringing that value, going right back to where we started with, actually, you know, what's the benefit of this decision-making process, this piece of governance? I think if we challenge all of our governance on, so what's the value it adds? Not just who's interested and why are they interested, but where's the value? I think that is the way to drive out your minimum viable governance.
Thank you. And I'm just going to go over to Kerry, who probably can speak from her own experiences. I was itching to come in with her own comments. Like, over to you, Kerry.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Claire, that's a brilliant point. The whole, what value does it add? So part of the governance and assurance work that we were looking at for Project Speed was doing exactly that sort of cradle to grave view of all of the governance that, you know, it's snakes and ladders, really, isn't it? That projects go through all the governance and assurance that happens. And governance and assurance are used independently, which is also not particularly helpful because they should do different things. So we looked at what, or where we're going to look at is for sort of big projects. What difference did those governance gateways make, and did they add value? Or was it just lots of clever people asking lots of clever questions because they're being, you know, paid to be clever and ask clever questions? Did it actually add value to the output and the outcome? And was it, you know, was the product improved as a result of it? And one of the other reflections was that you know, what you were saying about getting the right people and the right sign-offs. And everyone would agree that, governance gets in the way, you know, it's better less is more, you know, the barnacles on the boat type analogy. But when it comes to saying, okay, well, we'll skip you out of the chain then. Oh, no, not me, someone else, that other group, they don't add any value, but we do. So it's again, this is, you know, sort of down to the people. It's sort of understanding what motivates those people, why do they think they need to be consulted? You know, it's a big issue, particularly in the rail industry, where, you know, safety critical culture, where certain people have, you know, disproportionate sway over projects and how they proceed, you know, for the wrong or the right reasons. So there's definitely that. And the final point I'd make on this is that sometimes governance is used as a sort of stakeholder management tool, and actually it should, you know, stakeholder management should be taken off the grid and done separately and well and properly. But governance is not stakeholder management, and the two shouldn't really be confused. And I think they are quite often. So that was my 3 penny.
Hands raised. Andy, over to you.
Well, it's interesting because it's more than 10 years since the concept of integrated assurance and approval plans, you know, became common practice. And around 5 years since the project initiation route map was introduced with a focus on governance. So we actually know the answer to this already. You know, it's already codified and described in those documents. And both of those frameworks are not about setting out a rigid pathway to follow, but both of them are around understanding really early on what pathway is right for the project, and, you know, integrated assurance and approval plans, when used well, you know, the counter what, you know, Kerry just talked about, where there being, you know, governance meetings, if you like, are compensating for lazy or incomplete stakeholder engagement. But it also sets out really clearly the distinction between those who approve, genuine decision makers, versus those that are advising or those that are providing independent view. And they save projects, months, many months, possibly years, if they're done right, and setting out what needs to be done to get to yes and to stay at yes on projects, with the IAPs. And they're often seen as a bit of process to get through in order to move to the next step in a life cycle. Comes back to that behavioural thing again. They're really important, and do them right, they'll pay back 10 times.
It's brilliant. We've got a lot of chat in on the platform here on Pine around that very point, raising a very good point. Governance is not the same as stakeholder management. So if there is one key takeaway from this conversation, it is that point. So thank you all for chiming in agreement with that. I'm just going to put to another question, which is related to your point on lessons learned, Andy. One of the questions that's been posed here is the reason that lessons are not embedded due to poor governance? So roles, decision-making, culture, business case / clear outcome, etc. Discuss. So that's a bit of a difficult one. I'll repeat that for you. Is the reason that lessons are not embedded due to poor governance, roles, decision-making, culture, business cases, or clear outcomes, etc. Discuss. I'm going to start with Nick on that point. It's a big one, but I know.
Thank you, Gabriella, for that. No, seriously, I've been around the lessons learned debate for the best part of 40 years now in my career, and no amount of databases and no amount of process fixes this space. So when you're talking about lessons learned, it's really frustrating as a project manager when they say, don't forget to put the kettle on because the water boils quicker if you do that. That is not a lesson learned. That is a fundamental that you should know as a competent person and get on with it. So how do you define a lesson learned? Well, first of all, you have to actually understand it and capture them, and how you capture them and disseminate them. And then how do you expect people to absorb them and address them? And what I found is no amount of capturing them actually fixes it. You actually have to get down to a culture of sense of ownership that the delivery organization, with the challenge of delivering an opportunity, have a hunger to find out what lessons they need to know about to not make the mistakes of the past and to be successful. And if you have that kind of culture where they actively go out and try and understand and address the lessons, you typically have success. And actually, in my last role, we actually had a lessons learned heat map from our assurance reviews and our integrated assurance plans. So what is it telling us? What's the system telling us that we're blind to? And then we were able to go and challenge project teams to go and look, had they got similar? Had they addressed it? And I think you've got to have that positive mindset to drive, because process won't fix you in this space at all.
That leads quite nicely on to Claire and your roles in analysis and insights, if you'd like to add to that point of embedding lessons learned. Oh, I think you may be on mute.
You're right. So actually, I was listening to that and just thinking, I think Nick mentioned earlier, there is an element of that kind of continuous learning, and my willingness as a senior kind of program individual to still learn. And in some ways that applies as much to learning lessons as it does to learning skills. And in IBM, all of our senior delivery individuals were mandated to go on a training course where we were exposed to the lessons that had been learned from projects that had gone really badly wrong. And it's very easy when I'm going into a new program to say, I don't need to look at that. This is something that I fully understand. And actually that would never have happened if I'd been there. But actually, when you're sat in a room with your peers who you have the greatest of respect for, listening to actually what did happen through no, intentional fault, it focuses the mind, and then allowed us, I think, to be open to listening to what were those lessons, and then to take that away when we go back into delivery. So I think we were very much forced to open our ears to the lessons learned through mandatory senior level training, and it was hugely valuable in changing the mindset towards actually taking on board and looking for, where can I learn from the experiences where things have perhaps not gone as we expected? Because often it's, again, back to the failure comment, right? It's not necessarily a failure. It's not necessarily that things have gone wrong, but things have not gone the way that they should have done for lots of different reasons. And I think that was the comment I would like to make on that one.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to pull in Kerry now to add to this point on lessons learned.
It's something I'm vexed by, and it's certainly something that Project Speed needs to address, because we're in exactly that world, which is we're learning lessons as we go along. We've done lots of deep dives on various road and rail projects. So how do we try and apply those to other projects in not only the DFT portfolio but across government? I think there's something in here, as Claire suggested, that when you learn a lesson when it really affects you, when it affects you, like how does a child learn to walk? Well, they learn to walk because they try over and over again, but they probably hurt themselves along the way, and they think, well, I'm not going to do that again because that hurt. So is there something in lessons learned that you've almost got to feel and experience the pain in a way of what went wrong? And I don't know how you replicate that for, because we've all been in projects that have, that we've gone wrong and we've seen things go wrong, but how do we pass on that pain and that learning to others? And the other reflection I've got is in major projects is trying to actually isolate what the lessons learned are. So, even isolating what went wrong is quite difficult as well, because, trying to pull it out as a discrete event that you could say, well, that went wrong because of this, and therefore we won't do it again. I think it's a much more layered issue, and it's not quite so easy to pinpoint. If only we've done that instead of that, because just things aren't as binary as that when you're in the middle of a big major project. Things just aren't as easy to pick apart. So I think there's a number of reasons why lessons learned is a frustrating topic. So maybe that should be a future MPA seminar on why are we not learning lessons and how can we do it better.
I see Andy making notes of that. And then on the next discussion topic, I'm actually going to stay on the frustrating topic of lessons learned, because we have another question that's semi-related to that in the Mentimeter, and it says, a lot of programs in government are not delivering major infrastructure, but are equally challenging and complex that require different skills. How do we make sure it isn't just a one-size-fits-all? So to this point on lessons, can we quite easily shift a lesson learned from one place to another project, and especially when the project may not be infrastructure related? And I'll come to Andy on that point.
Definitely is the answer. So, lessons learned, apply at essentially sort of four levels, if you like. There's individual. So we all learn lessons as we progress through our careers, and the more we can expose ourselves to lessons, both ones we make ourselves and ones that we see others, both good and bad, by the way. There's an assumption here we're talking about bad lessons rather than good lessons. Then there's the team level lessons. So if we think of that sort of at a project level, and then there's the organizational or the enterprise in terms of building up their own understanding of lessons. And I would argue the fourth lesson is the community lessons, which is where the likes of the Major Projects Association come in, where we're enabling individuals, teams, and organisations to share across the domain so that projects improve overall. So that's those sort of four aspects of lessons. And I think we touched on it a bit earlier, but for me, the key is to take what I call a pull rather than a push approach to applying lessons. Otherwise, it's just information captured, isn't it? And often incomplete information captured. And if I sort of think back to when I was leading the authoring team to update Prince 2, it was one of, I think, three topics that came out significantly more than anything else in the sort of 2 years of study that we did leading up to the design of what the new updated method would include. But top three in there was why do we not learn lessons? But we added the principle in Prince 2 that it should be a pull rather than push activity. So it's the duty of everyone, and not just the project leader, but we put it in as the duty of everyone working on the project or involved with the project to seek lessons and apply them on the project that they're working. And that's not necessarily, often we think of it, big lessons for the project, but it can be small lessons as well about how, particular routines or activities or tasks are performed within a project overall, and they can add up to being quite significant, when you multiply them by the number of organisations involved in major projects. So I think I went off a little bit from the question, but about learning from each other. Yes, so an example, I've put two SROs together, one working on complex decommissioning and another one working in a charity that were going through transformation, and just got them to talk to each other. But the challenge they had was because the transformation generally compared to perhaps the infrastructure requirements, it can be more ambiguous in terms of what is really needed, and also the validity of the various options that are available. How do you know which one is definitely best? And it was about how can you unpick those to lock in those things that you need to do now, regardless of which of the options that you're going to go ahead with later. And there was just a context that both these had, where they needed to lock some things in what we call, banking, things, so that they could just say yes and move on, and leave some of the other things to later. And completely different environments, really different, but they learned from each other in terms of what they were undertaking through their transformation.
Thank you for that, Andy. And we are, don't know how, but time has flown and we are coming to the end of our event today. But I do leave the panelists with one final question. We've had a lot of discussions today, and there's been a lot of thoughts around pace, and which is why we're gathered here today. So I would like for each of you, in no more than a sentence, to share a key takeaway around the importance of pace for delivering major projects. And then I'll hand over to Andy to close off for today. So I will start with Nick, since you seem so eager to give us a killer line to end today's proceedings.
So I think I'd start by just saying time now, we just take too long on some of our most complex government projects. There's a huge opportunity to deliver faster, better, greener for the citizens of the UK. I think we owe it to them. And I think we need to look in the mirror and decide what are we going to change and fix to deliver that. And that's really, for me, what pace is all about. It's about delivering at the right pace, not taking unnecessarily too long and costing too much.
Thank you, Nick. And then I'll move on to Kerry next, and then Claire, and then we'll end off with Andy.
That one could have come up with something far more pithy. I would suggest that it's pace, but not at all costs. Pace where it's right, and it's not the sole driver. And I would also say make decisions more quickly, and that might be decisions to cancel projects as much as to move projects through a life cycle quicker.
You, Kerry, over to you, Claire.
So I think from this conversation, what I would take away in terms of pace is actually what we really need to focus on is pace to value, not just pace in delivery. So it's about having that focus in the right place and getting all of the people aligned behind that objective of pace to value.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Now over to you, Andy.
Yeah, sort of building on the pace to value theme there. I think if pace, but that's taken the full life cycle view. Otherwise, some decisions you can make early on, you'll perhaps live to regret. So that's not just sort of through the project life cycle, but into operations and then beyond, when you've got things like decommissioning to think about in terms of whole life value, whole life cost. But each of those all the way through. I would like to draw on perhaps a motorsport analogy, which is the quickest way around a corner is to go slow in, out fast. So you want to hit the apex, being able to put as maximum power on as possible without spinning, and that's what we're talking about. Isn't it? We've got to go in as not too slow, but as fast as we can, but in slow, out fast is the analogy in motorsport for the quickest way around a corner.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Andy. And that concludes the content for today's event. So I will pass back to you, Andy, to close off today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And apologies for those who may have arrived a little late and missed the news that unfortunately the Right Honourable Jessie Norman was unable to join us. So Gabriella, really thank you very much for responding to that and keeping the questions flowing and expertly chairing our session this afternoon. I think everyone would agree. If we could see everyone now, I'm sure there'd be rounds of applause for you in terms of your chairing of our session. Before I close off, though, I'd just like to just highlight some of the events that we've got coming up into next year. So 19th of January, we have the fourth of our 6 roundtables doing a deeper dive into the topic of project pace. And that's looking at governance. We've touched on that quite a lot today, is the deep dive on that one. So it's a roundtable looking at governance and pace. There's a breakfast seminar on the 21st of January looking at learning to lead, followed by another roundtable looking at pace, looking at different methodologies and things like portfolio, program management, how you package up projects and so on. I'm sure the Agile will come up within that discussion as well. And then the last one we got on the paces around the consents, sorry, the role of regulators is coming up on that one. Then we've got an event on the 25th of February around climate and sustainability. So linking back to our topics earlier of the Build Back Better and greener and the green recovery as well. Also look out for news. This is the third in a series of joint events with the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, and we'll soon be announcing the topic and timing of our fourth one. So keep an eye out on social media and also our website for details of that one. So thank you once again. Thank you to panelists and to Gabriella for chairing. Thank you to everyone for coming along to listen in today, and hope you're all safe, and we'll see you all in the new year.